All right, so we're diving deep into Canadian criminal law today. Looks like we've got a pretty hefty document all about essential elements of criminal code offenses.
Heavy stuff, for sure.
But hey, no worries.
Yeah,
We are going to break it down,
absolutely.
help you navigate these legal waters like a pro. I'm really curious to see what insights we uncover today. Ready to get started?
Absolutely. From what I'm seeing, this document is like a cheat sheet for law enforcement.
Okay.
Maybe even a study guide for legal professionals up in Canada. It's all about the nuts and bolts of what makes something a crime. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, so we're talking about the building blocks of Canadian criminal law. I'm noticing breach of the peace right at the top.
Right at the top.
Seems pretty basic, but I bet there's more to it than meets the eye. What actually constitutes a breach in the eyes of the law?
You're right. There's always more beneath the surface. It's not just about being loud or annoying your neighbor. A breach of the peace involves an act or actions that cause actual or threatened harm. It's got to be serious enough to warrant police intervention. It's like stepping in to prevent a brawl.
So picture a shouting match.
Yeah.
Escalating into a full-blown fight.
Mm-hmm.
The police wouldn't just stand there, right? They'd have to intervene to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control.
Exactly. It's all about preventing that potential for violence and maintaining public order. Now imagine the police arrive at this heated scene and someone decides to get in their way. That's where obstruction of a peace officer comes into play.
I can see where this is going. Things are already tense, police are trying to de-escalate the situation, and suddenly someone's interfering with their duties. Recipe for disaster. What does the law actually say about obstructing a peace officer?
It boils down to willfully hindering a peace officer who's carrying out their legal duties. Think of it this way. Accidentally bumping into an officer in a crowded space is one thing, but deliberately getting in their way or preventing them from making a lawful arrest, that's obstruction.
Hold on, willfully obstructing. That sounds super specific. What does that actually mean in legal terms?
Great question. Willfully implies intention.
Okay.
It means doing something knowingly or purposefully. The document even mentions an official obstruction warning. This shows how police communicate their authority and expectations, drawing a clear line in the sand.
So it's not about accidental interference. It's about someone consciously choosing to hinder the police. And that warning makes it crystal clear when someone is crossing the line. I'm sensing a theme here. Intent seems to be a big deal in Canadian criminal law.
You're picking up on a crucial point.
Yeah.
Intent often plays a pivotal role in determining whether an action constitutes a crime. Now, speaking of intent, let's dive into a topic that's probably pretty familiar, assault.
Okay, assault. It's a word we hear all the time, but I'm guessing there's more to it legally than just a simple shove or a punch. What are the real nuts and bolts of assault in Canadian law?
You're right. There are definitely nuances here. Assault, in its various forms, basically involves intentionally violating someone's physical safety.
Okay.
But what's fascinating is that Canadian law places a huge emphasis on consent.
Consent? So, like, if I playfully shove my friend, that's not assault because it's all in good fun. But what if it's unwanted, even if meant as a joke? Where does the law draw the line?
That's exactly where things get interesting. Consent, whether expressed or implied, is a key element in determining if an act constitutes assault. Think about those everyday interactions where physical contact is expected, like playing sports, for instance. There's an implied consent in those contexts. But if someone pushes you aggressively without your permission, that's a whole different ballgame.
So context matters a lot. What about threats? Does yelling, "I'm gonna punch you," count as assault?
That's where things get a bit more complex. Section 265 of the Criminal Code comes into play here.
Okay.
It requires not just a threat, but an act or gesture that makes the threat believable.
Yeah.
The victim needs to reasonably believe the person has the present ability to carry it out.
So just yelling empty threats probably wouldn't cut it.
Right.
But if you ball up your fist and make a menacing gesture while making the threat, that could be a different story.
Exactly. It's about creating a genuine fear for someone's safety. Now consider this. You mentioned carrying a weapon earlier. How do you think that factors into assault?
That's an interesting question. I'm guessing it's not a good thing. But seriously, I have no idea how carrying a weapon relates to assault legally. What does the document say?
Well, according to Section 265(1)(c), openly carrying a weapon while accosting, impeding, or begging someone is considered assault, even if you don't actually use it.
Okay.
It's about the implied threat and the power dynamic it creates.
Right.
Imagine someone brandishing a knife while aggressively begging for money. that's inherently intimidating and could easily escalate into violence.
Okay, so even if you're not physically touching someone, just the act of wielding a weapon in a threatening way can be considered assault because it creates that fear and intimidation factor. I'm also curious about those specific terms, accosting, impeding, and begging. What do they actually mean in this context?
Good point. Let's break those down. Accosting means to persistently solicit or bother someone with unwanted requests. Impeding means to obstruct or hinder someone's progress. And begging refers to earnestly asking for money or food. The point is, even during these actions, which might not be inherently criminal on their own, the presence of a weapon adds a layer of menace that can constitute assault.
So we've got these basic types of assault, but then things can escalate pretty quickly, right? I see the document mentions assault with a weapon, assault causing bodily harm, aggravated assault, and sexual assault. What makes these different from the basic forms of assault we've been discussing?
You're right, there are different levels of assault,
Uh-huh.
and they hinge on the severity of the actions and the harm caused. Let's take assault with a weapon, for instance. Pretty self-explanatory, right? It involves using a weapon to assault someone, like a knife or a bat.
Uh-huh.
The key here is that the weapon is actually used in the assault.
And that's different from simply carrying a weapon, like we talked about before, where it's more about the implied threat.
Okay, got it. What about assault causing bodily harm? What makes that different?
With assault causing bodily harm, the focus shifts to the injuries inflicted.
Okay.
It's not just about unwanted contact anymore. There has to be actual harm that interferes with the victim's health or comfort. Think bruises, cuts that require medical attention, anything that goes beyond fleeting pain or discomfort.
So a black eye or a cut that needs stitches would likely fall under assault causing bodily harm, right?
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then things can get even more serious, like with aggravated assault, I'm guessing. What does that involve?
You're absolutely right. Aggravated assault is where things take a truly frightening turn.
Yeah.
Here, we're talking about severe injuries, wounds, maiming, disfigurement, or even putting the victim's life in danger. The consequences are far more severe because of the level of harm inflicted. That sounds terrifying. It's a whole different level of violence. What about sexual assault? How does Canadian law define that?
Sexual assault is any assault that occurs in circumstances of a sexual nature.
Okay.
It's about violating the victim's sexual integrity, and the key is that a reasonable person would see the act as inherently sexual.
So it's not just about physical force or violence. It's about violating someone's sexual boundaries without their consent. I'm noticing the document also mentions a bunch of aggravating factors for sexual assault, like using a weapon, threatening harm to someone other than the victim, or causing bodily harm. What's the significance of these aggravating factors? Do they make the crime even more serious?
You're absolutely right. Aggravating factors elevate the severity of the offense,
Right.
which can lead to harsher penalties. Think of it this way. A sexual assault involving a weapon will carry a more severe sentence than one without. Similarly, if the victim suffers serious bodily harm, the consequences for the perpetrator will be more severe. It's about recognizing the increased level of harm and holding offenders accountable for their actions.
Okay, that makes sense. The document also lists these specific categories of sexual assault, like sexual assault with a weapon, sexual assault causing bodily harm, and aggravated sexual assault. They seem to mirror the categories we just discussed for regular assault. Is there a connection there?
You're right on the money. You're noticing the patterns here, which is fantastic. These categories essentially apply the same principles of severity to sexual assault cases. For example, sexual assault with a weapon involves using a weapon during the assault, just like its non-sexual counterpart.
Right.
And aggravated sexual assault involves inflicting those severe injuries we talked about earlier, like wounding, maiming, or endangering the victim's life.
This is some pretty heavy stuff, but it's incredibly important to understand. Okay, I'm ready to move on to the next offense. I see criminal harassment listed next. That sounds pretty ominous. What are the essential elements that make something criminal harassment?
Criminal harassment, often called stalking, is all about engaging in a pattern of behavior that causes the victim to fear for their safety or the safety of someone they know. And this fear has to be reasonable, meaning any reasonable person in the same situation would also feel threatened. It's not about a one-off incident. It's about a persistent pattern of unwelcome attention that creates a climate of fear.
Okay, so we're not talking about a casual acquaintance who happens to bump into you at the grocery store a few times.
Right.
This is about a deliberate and persistent pattern of behavior. What kinds of behaviors would actually constitute criminal harassment? Just thinking about it is giving me the chills.
The source material provides a pretty comprehensive list,
Okay.
and it includes things like repeatedly following the victim, bombarding them with unwanted communication, watching their home or workplace, or making threats against them or their family. It's all about creating that sense of fear and intimidation.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So if someone's constantly texting and calling another person, even after being asked to stop, could that be considered criminal harassment?
Absolutely, especially if those communications are unwanted, and make the recipient genuinely fear for their safety. And remember, it's not just about direct contact. Things like leaving unwanted gifts or showing up at the victim's workplace unannounced can also contribute to a pattern of harassment.
It's all about creating that climate of fear and intimidation. It's not just a one-time thing.
Right.
It's a pattern of behavior that makes the victim feel unsafe.
Okay, got it.
Hmm.
Let's move on to the next offense. I see uttering threats listed here. What distinguishes a threat that crosses the line into criminal behavior?
Uttering threats is about knowingly conveying a threat to cause death or bodily harm to a person, damage property, or harm an animal belonging to someone else. The key here is the intent to intimidate, or for the threat to be taken seriously. It's not about venting frustration in the heat of the moment. It's about deliberately instilling fear and conveying a serious intent to cause harm.
So does that mean something like saying, I'm so mad I could just scream in a heated argument would be considered uttering threats? Not necessarily. Context is crucial here. Uttering threats requires a deliberate act to instill fear and convey a genuine intent to cause harm. Your example sounds more like an expression of frustration than a genuine threat.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about more than just words. It's about the intent behind those words and whether they create a real sense of fear.
All right, I'm ready for the next one. Let's see, we have unlawfully in a dwelling house. This one seems particularly concerning. What are the key elements that make someone unlawfully present in a dwelling house?
This offense addresses the presumption that someone found unlawfully inside a dwelling house is there to commit an indictable offense. It's about protecting the sanctity of people's homes and deterring criminal activity.
So if I accidentally wander into my neighbor's house thinking it's mine because they look similar, could I be charged with unlawfully in a dwelling house? Well, it sounds like an honest mistake. The onus would be on you to prove you had no intention of committing a crime. The law presumes criminal intent unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. It highlights the importance of respecting property boundaries and ensuring you have a legitimate reason to be on someone else's property.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not about punishing innocent mistakes. It's about deterring criminals and protecting homeowners. Now, let's tackle a big one. Break and enter. It seemed like there are a few different scenarios covered under this umbrella term. Can you break those down for us?
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Break and enter encompasses three main situations.
Okay.
Breaking into a place with the intent to commit an indictable offense. Breaking into a place and actually committing an indictable offense. And breaking out of a place after committing or intending to commit an indictable offense.
So the first scenario is all about intent. Even if someone breaks in but doesn't actually steal anything, they could still be charged.
Absolutely. The act of breaking in with the intention of committing a crime is enough to constitute break and enter. It's about recognizing that the act of unlawful entry itself is a serious offense, regardless of whether any further crimes are committed. Then, of course, we have the second scenario where the break-in leads to an actual crime like theft or vandalism.
In the third scenario, breaking out, that's interesting.
Yeah,
So if someone breaks a window to escape after robbing a store, that's still considered break and enter.
precisely. It covers all aspects of unlawful entry and exit related to criminal activity. It's a comprehensive offense that aims to address the full spectrum of break-in scenarios.
Okay.
And I want to point out a specific term mentioned in the document, constructive break. That means you don't necessarily have to physically break something to enter.
Right.
It could involve using threats, deception, collusion with someone inside, or even entering through an already open door or window with criminal intent.
Okay, so break and enter is about more than just smashing windows and picking locks. There are a lot of ways for unlawful entry to occur. The document also mentions a home invasion aggravating circumstance. What makes a home invasion different from regular break and enter?
A home invasion is a much more serious offense because it involves breaking into an occupied dwelling and using or threatening violence against the occupants or their property. It recognizes the heightened trauma and risk associated with invading someone's personal space while they're present.
So it's not just about the property crime, it's about the potential for violence and harm to the people inside the home. That makes sense. Okay, moving on to forcible entry into real property. How does this one work?
This offense addresses entering another person's real property, which means land and buildings that aren't dwelling houses, in a way that's likely to cause a breach of the peace. It's about protecting property rights and ensuring people can occupy their property peacefully.
So, barging into someone's office building or warehouse in a threatening way would fall under this category.
Precisely. There has to be an element of violence or threatened violence in the way someone enters the property for it to qualify as forcible entry. It's not about accidental trespass. It's about a deliberate act of aggression.
Okay, got it. Now we have trespass at night. This one seems a bit less intense than the previous ones. What's the story with this offense?
You're right. It's a less serious offense, but still important to understand. Trespass at night is about loitering or prowling on someone else's property near a dwelling house at night, specifically between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. without a lawful excuse. It's about addressing those behaviors that might seem harmless during the day, but take on a more suspicious and potentially threatening nature under the cover of darkness.
So if I'm taking a shortcut through my neighbor's yard at 10 p.m., could I be charged with trespass at night?
Possibly, especially if you're lurking around near their house or behaving suspiciously.
Okay.
The key here is that loitering and prowling suggest a lack of legitimate purpose for being on the property. It's not about simply passing through, it's about hanging around without a good reason.
Okay, so just passing through quickly might not be an issue. But lingering or acting shady could get you into trouble. What if I have a genuine reason to be there? Like, my neighbor's dog got loose and I'm trying to catch it.
That's where the lawful excuse element comes in. If you have a reasonable explanation for being on the property at night, it might not be considered trespass at night. The law recognizes that there are legitimate reasons to be on someone else's property after dark.
It's good to know there's some wiggle room there.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to theft. This one seems pretty straightforward on the surface, but I'm guessing there are some legal nuances we need to unpack. What makes something theft in the eyes of the law?
You're right. Theft is about more than just taking something that doesn't belong to you. It involves fraudulently taking or converting anything, whether animate or inanimate, with the intent to deprive the owner of it, either temporarily or permanently. And the document emphasizes that the taking must be done without color of right. That means the person doesn't genuinely believe they have a legal right to the item.
So borrowing my roommate's sweater without asking wouldn't be theft,
Right.
but sneaking into a store and pocketing a necklace would be. Because in the first case, you might be a bit annoying, but there's no intent to permanently deprive your roommate of their sweater, right?
Exactly. In the first scenario, you might be guilty of annoying your roommate or violating their trust, but it wouldn't meet the legal definition of theft. In the second scenario, there's a clear intent to permanently deprive the store of its property.
Okay, that makes sense. What about if I find a lost wallet and decide to keep the cash inside? Is that considered theft?
That's a tricky one. It could be considered theft, especially if you make no effort to return the wallet or locate its owner. The key is whether you're intentionally and knowingly depriving the rightful owner of their property. If you find a wallet and make a genuine effort to return it, that demonstrates a lack of criminal intent. But if you find a wad of cash and decide finders, keepers, losers, weepers, that's a different story.
So intent plays a huge role in theft, just like we saw with those earlier offenses.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the document also mentions a bunch of different types of theft, like theft of a credit card and possession of property obtained by crime. What makes these unique? Are they basically just variations on the basic principles of theft?
You got it. These are essentially specific applications of those core principles we just discussed.
Okay.
For instance, theft of a credit card goes beyond simply stealing the physical card. It involves stealing, forging, falsifying, or knowingly using a stolen or revoked credit card. It recognizes the unique vulnerability and potential for harm associated with credit card theft in today's digital world.
So if I find a credit card on the ground and use it to buy groceries, even if I don't know who it belongs to, that's still a crime.
Yes, that would be considered theft of a credit card. You're knowingly using a card that isn't yours for personal gain, and that's a violation of the law, regardless of whether you know the owner's identity.
Okay, so no finders keepers when it comes to credit cards. What about possession of property obtained by a crime? What are the essential elements there?
This offense involves possessing any property, knowing that it was obtained through a crime. It doesn't matter if you stole the item yourself or received it from someone else. The key is that you're aware of its illegal origins and still choose to keep it.
So if my friend gives me a brand new TV and I strongly suspect it might be stolen, but I accept it anyway, could I be charged with possession of property obtained by crime?
Yes, that's definitely a possibility. The law expects you to exercise due diligence and question the origins of property, especially if something seems too good to be true. Turning a blind eye to suspicious circumstances doesn't absolve you of responsibility. If you have reason to believe something's stolen, accepting it is a risky move.
That's a good reminder to always be cautious and ask questions. All right, next up is possession of break-in instruments. That sounds pretty self-explanatory, but I'm sure there are some legal wrinkles we need to iron out. What does it actually take to be charged with this offense?
It's not simply about having tools that could be used for breaking in. It's about possessing those tools. Things like lockpicks, crowbars, or even screwdrivers, with the specific knowledge and intent to use them for unlawful entry.
Okay.
The prosecution has to prove that you possess these tools for that very purpose.
So carrying a screwdriver in my toolbox for home repairs is perfectly fine, but having a set of lockpicks and acting suspiciously near a parked car might raise some red flags.
Exactly. It's all about context and intent. The presence of these tools alone isn't necessarily criminal. It's the combination of the tools and your actions that could lead to charges. The document even mentions a PBI warning,
Oh,
a notice police can give if they find these tools and believe you might be up to no good. They'll ask for an explanation for having those tools in your possession.
okay, so if you're stopped by the police and they find a crowbar in your bag, they might give you a PBI warning and ask you to explain yourself. What if you have a legitimate reason for having the tool, like you're a construction worker or something?
If you can provide a believable explanation that's consistent with your profession or the circumstances, it's less likely that you'll face charges. The key is to be honest and cooperative with the police. Clear communication can go a long way in these situations.
Good advice. Okay, let's move on to robbery. This one seems like it's got to be a pretty serious offense. What are the essential elements that set robbery apart from other crimes?
Robbery takes theft to a whole other level.
Okay.
It involves stealing something while using violence or threats of violence against a person or their property
Right.
to extort the stolen goods or overcome resistance. It's essentially theft plus the added element of force or intimidation.
So if someone holds up a convenience store with a gun demanding money,
Yeah,
that's a classic case of robbery.
absolutely. They're using a weapon and threats of violence to steal money.
Okay.
The document outlines a few different scenarios that qualify as robbery,
Right.
all involving a combination of theft and violence or threats.
What are some of the other scenarios that would fall under robbery?
One scenario involves stealing directly from a person and using violence against them at the time of the theft,
Okay.
immediately before or immediately afterward.
Okay.
Another scenario involves assaulting someone with the intent to steal from them.
Okay.
And finally, there's robbery that involves stealing while armed with a weapon, even if the weapon isn't actually used.
So even if someone doesn't actually use a weapon, as long as they have it on them during the theft, it's still considered a robbery.
Yes, the presence of the weapon alone is enough to escalate the offense to robbery because it creates a heightened sense of threat and danger. It shows a willingness to use force, if necessary, which makes the crime much more serious.
Okay, so robbery is basically theft plus that added element of force or intimidation. Got it. Now, what about extortion? How is that defined in Canadian law?
Extortion is about using threats, accusations, menaces, or violence to force someone to do something or give you something.
Okay.
It's about using coercion for personal gain.
So if I threaten to spread rumors about my coworker unless they give me a promotion, that's extortion. Because I'm using a threat to get something I want, right?
Yes, that's a classic example of extortion. You're using a threat to coerce your coworker into doing something against their will for your personal gain. The document emphasizes that extortion must be done without reasonable justification or excuse, meaning your actions can't be legally or morally defensible.
Right.
You're not entitled to that promotion, and you're using an unethical and illegal tactic to try to get it.
Okay, so blackmailing someone is a definite no-go. It's all about using those threats or accusations to pressure someone into doing something they wouldn't otherwise do. All right, let's delve into kidnapping next. What are the defining features of this crime? It sounds pretty terrifying.
Kidnapping involves taking someone against their will
Uh-huh.
with the intent to confine them, send them out of Canada illegally, or hold them for ransom or forced service. It's about the unlawful seizure and detention of a person for a specific purpose.
So it's not just about holding someone captive, it's about the intent behind the abduction.
Right.
They're being held for a specific reason, ransom, forced labor, or something else.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm seeing the document also lists several offenses related to abduction, specifically involving children. What makes these different from kidnapping? Is it just the age of the victim?
You're right, the age of the victim is a key factor, but there's more to it than that. Abduction offenses specifically focus on unlawfully taking, enticing, concealing, detaining, or harboring a child under a certain age. The specific age varies depending on the circumstances and whether the abductor is a parent or guardian. It recognizes the unique vulnerability of children and the need for specific laws to protect them.
So if a non-custodial parent takes their child without the consent of the custodial parent, that could be considered abduction. Yes, that's a classic example, especially if the child is under 14 years old. There are also specific offenses related to abduction that occurs in violation of a custody order. The law takes custody arrangements very seriously, and interfering with those arrangements can have serious consequences.
Okay, so it gets even more complex when custody arrangements are involved.
Right.
But it makes sense protecting children is paramount. Now we have forcible confinement. How does this one differ from kidnapping? They seem pretty similar on the surface.
You're right. They both involve restricting someone's freedom, but there's a key distinction. Forcible confinement focuses solely on the act of confining, imprisoning, or forcibly seizing someone without lawful authority.
Okay.
Unlike kidnapping, it doesn't require specific intent for the confinement. It's simply about the unlawful restriction of freedom.
So if someone locks me in a room against my will but doesn't demand a ransom or try to transport me anywhere, that could still be considered forcible confinement.
Exactly. The focus is on the act of unlawfully restricting someone's freedom of movement, regardless of the underlying motive. The law recognizes that any form of unlawful confinement is a serious violation of personal liberty.
Okay, got it. Now, what about hostage taking? What sets this one apart from the other offenses we've discussed?
Hostage taking involves forcibly confining someone and threatening them with death or bodily harm or continued confinement.
Okay.
To force a third party, like a government organization or another individual, to do something, it's about using a person as a pawn to achieve a specific goal.
So it's essentially a more elaborate and dangerous form of extortion where a person's life is literally on the line. That's incredibly serious.
You're absolutely right. Hostage-taking is a highly dangerous and complex crime with severe consequences. The document emphasizes that the demand made in a hostage situation can be express or implied, meaning it doesn't have to be explicitly stated. The circumstances and actions of the hostage-taker can convey the demand.
This deep dive is getting pretty intense. We've gone from shouting matches to hostage situations in the blink of an eye. Maybe we can lighten things up a bit with the next offense. Let's see, we have disguise with intent. What does that entail? It sounds like something straight out of a spy movie.
This offense is about masking or disguising your face with the intent to commit an indictable offense. It recognizes that concealing your identity is often a precursor to criminal activity. It's about removing that layer of anonymity and accountability.
So wearing a mask on Halloween is perfectly fine, but wearing a mask while robbing a bank is a big problem.
Exactly. It's all about context and intent. Halloween masks are associated with a harmless, festive tradition. But when a mask is used to conceal identity during a crime, it becomes a tool for evading justice. The law recognizes that distinction and treats disguise as a serious offense when it's used to facilitate criminal activity.
Okay, so no masked bank robberies. Got it. Now let's move on to intimidation. This one seems pretty broad. What kinds of actions would qualify as intimidation in the eyes of the law?
Intimidation is about using various tactics to wrongfully compel someone to do something they have a lawful right to do, or to refrain from doing something they have a lawful right to abstain from doing. It's about using coercion to interfere with someone's legal rights and freedoms.
So it's about using pressure or fear to manipulate someone's actions, even if those actions are perfectly legal. Okay, what are some examples of behaviors that would fall under intimidation? I'm guessing there are quite a few.
You're right, there's a whole range of behaviors that can constitute intimidation. The list includes using violence or threats of violence against the person or their loved ones, damaging their property, intimidating them with threats of future harm, persistently following them, hiding their belongings, blocking a highway, or besetting or watching their home or workplace. It's about creating a hostile environment to exert control over someone.
Wow, that's a lot of different ways to intimidate someone. So if I threaten to fire my employee if they don't vote for a particular candidate in an election, would that be considered intimidation?
Yes, that's a potential example. You're using your position of power to coerce your employee into acting against their own free will. The threat of job loss is a powerful motivator that can be used for intimidation. And the document highlights that intimidation can extend beyond the individual being targeted.
Right.
It can include threats or actions directed at their intimate partner, children, or other relatives. It's about using those close relationships as leverage to exert control.
This is starting to feel like a legal thriller. We've covered so much ground already, but it looks like there's still more to explore.
What's next on our deep dive into the Canadian Criminal Code?
Let's dive into the world of mischief. This is where we shift from protecting people to protecting property, and things can get pretty interesting.
Mischief. It sounds a bit like a prank gone wrong, but I'm sure there's more to it than meets the eye. What are the key elements that make an act mischief in the legal sense?
You're right, there's more to it than just harmless pranks. Mischief involves willfully destroying or damaging property, rendering property dangerous, useless, or ineffective. Okay.
Or obstructing, interrupting, or interfering with the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property. It's essentially about intentionally causing harm or disruption to someone else's property or their ability to use it.
Okay, so if I get...
Okay, so if I get angry and smash my neighbor's mailbox,
Yeah.
that's definitely mischief. I'm intentionally destroying their property,
Right,
right?
right.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's a clear-cut case of mischief. But it can also be more subtle, like tampering with someone's car so it won't start,
Yeah.
or blocking access to their driveway. It's not always about outright destruction. It can also involve rendering property unusable or interfering with someone's peaceful enjoyment of their property.
What about if I play loud music late at night, disturbing my neighbors? Would that be considered mischief?
That's a great question. While it might be incredibly annoying and inconsiderate, it wouldn't necessarily fall under mischief unless you're specifically targeting their property. For example, blasting music directly at their house with the intent to cause damage or disrupt their use of their property. Otherwise, it might fall under a different offense, like causing a disturbance.
Okay, so it's not just about being a nuisance. It has to involve a deliberate act against someone's property or their right to use and enjoy that property peacefully. The document also mentions a category called mischief endangering life. What makes that different from regular mischief?
Mischief endangering life is a much more serious form of mischief that involves actions that actually put someone's life at risk. It recognizes that some acts of mischief can have far-reaching consequences beyond property damage. Think about tampering with someone's brakes or cutting a climbing rope. Those actions could easily lead to serious injury or even death.
That makes sense. It highlights the potential for harm that certain acts of mischief can create. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about unlawful assembly. What are the elements that make an assembly unlawful? Is it just about the number of people gathered in one place?
It's more nuanced than just a head count. An unlawful assembly involves 3 or more people gathering with a common purpose and behaving in a way that causes people in the neighborhood to fear,
Okay.
on reasonable grounds,
Right.
that they will disturb the peace violently or provoke others to do so. It's about recognizing the potential for crowds to become unruly and threaten public safety.
So a peaceful protest wouldn't be considered an unlawful assembly,
Right.
but a mob that's destroying property and threatening violence would be.
Yeah.
Because in the first case, there's no reasonable fear of violence, but in the second case, it's pretty clear that things are about to get out of hand. Right?
Exactly. The key difference lies in the behavior of the group
Mm-hmm.
and whether their actions create a legitimate fear of violence or disruption. Peaceful assembly is a protected right in Canada, but when a group crosses the line into violence or incitement, it becomes unlawful.
Okay.
The law aims to balance those rights with the need to protect public safety.
Okay, so it's about the potential for harm and disruption, not just the number of people gathered. That makes sense. Now, what about causing a disturbance? What are the key elements of this offense? Is it just about being loud and annoying?
It's a bit more specific than that. Causing a disturbance involves engaging in disruptive behavior in a public place or in a way that disturbs the occupants of a dwelling house. Think fighting, screaming, being drunk and disorderly, impeding or molesting others, making indecent exhibitions, loitering or obstructing the flow of traffic or pedestrians.
So if I have a loud, heated argument with my partner in the middle of a crowded restaurant, could I be charged with causing a disturbance? because we're disrupting the peace and other patrons are getting an earful of our personal drama.
Yes, that's definitely a possibility. You're creating a scene
Hmm.
and disrupting the peace in a public place. The key is that your actions must actually disturb other people and negatively impact their enjoyment of the space.
Oh.
It's not about being a little loud or having a brief disagreement. It's about causing a significant disruption to the public order.
What about if I'm just walking down the street singing at the top of my lungs? Is that a disturbance?
It depends.
Oh.
If you're belting out a beautiful area
Yeah.
and everyone's enjoying the impromptu concert,
Yeah.
you're probably fine.
Right.
But if you're tone deaf and people are covering their ears in agony, that could be a different story.
Okay.
The source material emphasizes that police officers can't be considered disturbed parties for this offense.
Okay.
It's about the impact on ordinary citizens and their right to enjoy public spaces peacefully.
Okay, so it's not about personal preferences or musical taste. It's about objectively disruptive behavior that impacts the public. Got it. Now, it looks like we're shifting gears again. The document also lists some driving offenses related to impaired driving and refusal to provide a breath sample. Can you break down those offenses for us? This is an area where I think a lot of people have questions and misconceptions.
Absolutely. Impaired driving is a serious issue with potentially devastating consequences, so it's crucial to understand the law. Impaired driving involves operating a vehicle while your ability to drive is impaired to any degree by alcohol or drugs.
Okay.
This means there's no magic number. Any amount of alcohol or drugs in your system can lead to charges if it affects your driving ability.
Right.
And the law also covers situations where you exceed specific blood alcohol or drug concentration limits within 2 hours of driving.
So even if I've only had one drink but my driving affected, I can still be charged. There's no one drink rule or anything like that.
That's right. The focus is on impairment, not a specific number of drinks. The law recognizes that even small amounts of alcohol or drugs can impair your judgment, reaction time, and coordination, making it dangerous to drive. It's always best to err on the side of caution and avoid driving if you've consumed any alcohol or drugs.
Okay, so the message is clear. If you're going to drink, don't drive. What about refusing to provide a breath sample? What are the legal implications of that?
Refusing to provide a breath sample when requested by a police officer is a separate offense with serious consequences. You must have reasonable grounds to refuse, such as a medical condition that prevents you from blowing into the device. Otherwise, refusing a breath sample can lead to hefty fines, license suspensions, and even jail time. The law sees it as an attempt to obstruct justice and avoid accountability for impaired driving.
Okay, so it's never a good idea to refuse a breathalyzer test unless you have a legitimate medical reason. Got it. Now let's talk about drug offenses. I see some sections here related to drug possession, trafficking, and production. What are the essential elements of those offenses?
Drug offenses in Canada are governed by the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, or CDSA. Possession of a controlled substance involves having a substance listed in Schedule 1.2 or .3 of the CDSA in your possession without authorization. Trafficking involves selling, giving, transferring, or delivering a controlled substance, or representing a substance as a controlled substance.
Right.
And production involves manufacturing, synthesizing, altering, cultivating, propagating, or harvesting a controlled substance without authorization. These are serious offenses with significant penalties.
So if I have a small amount of marijuana in my pocket, even for personal use, is that considered possession? I know the laws around cannabis have changed in recent years, so I'm a bit confused about what's legal and what's not.
You're right, the cannabis laws have evolved. While personal possession of small amounts of cannabis is now legal in Canada, there are still restrictions on the amount you can possess, where you can consume it, and how you can obtain it. Possessing larger quantities or selling cannabis without a license would still be illegal.
Yeah.
It's essential to stay informed about the specific regulations in your province or territory.
Okay, so the specifics of drug laws can vary depending on the substance and the circumstances. It's always best to err on the side of caution and check the current regulations. The document also mentions possession for the purpose of trafficking. How does that differ from simple possession?
That's a great question. Possession for the purpose of trafficking involves possessing a controlled substance with the intent to sell or distribute it.
Okay.
It's a more serious offense than simple possession because it indicates involvement in the drug trade. The prosecution might consider factors like the quantity of drugs, packaging, paraphernalia associated with drug dealing like scales or baggies, and any statements or actions that suggest an intention to traffic.
So if I have a large amount of cocaine divided into small baggies, along with a scale and a wad of cash, That would be pretty strong evidence of possession for the purpose of trafficking, even if I claim it's all for personal use.
Exactly. The circumstances surrounding the possession would strongly suggest an intention to traffic, making it a much more serious offense than simple possession. And here's another interesting wrinkle. The document highlights that any substance represented as a controlled substance, even if it isn't actually a drug,
Okay.
can be subject to trafficking charges.
Interesting.
So if someone sells baking soda disguised as cocaine, they could still face serious penalties for trafficking a counterfeit substance.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's not just about the actual drugs, it's also about the intent to deceive and the potential harm that could result from selling fake drugs. This document is packed with interesting details and legal nuances. I'm noticing a section called Charge Sections Routine Offenses. What's the significance of this section? Why are these offenses singled out?
This section appears to be a quick reference for commonly encountered offenses in Canada. It lists a range of offenses, from mischief and theft to assault and impaired driving, along with the corresponding sections of the criminal code. It's likely a handy tool for law enforcement officers and legal professionals to quickly identify the appropriate charges for various situations.
So it's like a cheat sheet for navigating the criminal code. I'm always fascinated by those behind-the-scenes glimpses into how the legal system works. I also noticed a section called Miller's Exam Offense Section. What's a Miller's Exam, and why are these offenses singled out?
A Miller's exam is a judicial hearing to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a criminal prosecution. It's typically used in cases where an accused person is being held in custody and hasn't been released on bail. The offenses listed in this section seem to represent crimes that are often subject to Miller's exams, likely due to their serious nature or the potential for public safety concerns.
So it's a way to quickly assess whether there's enough evidence to hold someone in custody while they await trial, especially for serious offenses that might pose a risk to the public. That makes sense. It's about balancing individual rights with public safety. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground today, from breaches of the peace and assaults to drug offenses and even those behind-the-scenes legal procedures. But it looks like there's still more to explore. This document also delves into Highway Traffic Act offenses. I guess we're not done yet.
You're right, we've only just scratched the surface. It seems you've got a comprehensive guide to common driving offenses in Canada. Everything from speeding and distracted driving to disobeying traffic signals and failing to signal lane changes.
Okay, so we've gone from breaches of the peace to assaults to theft, and now we're hitting the road. I'm ready to buckle up and explore the world of traffic violations. What are some of the key things we need to understand to stay safe and legal on Canadian roads?
Great question. Let's start with something that might seem pretty basic, but it's actually one of the most common traffic violations: exceeding the speed limit.
Okay.
I'm seeing a section here called Speed Limit in Force, in the location at the time. What are the key elements of this offense?
Okay, speed limit in force in the location at the time. That seems pretty straightforward, but I'm sure there are some legal nuances we need to be aware of. What does the document say about this offense?
This offense is all about exceeding the posted speed limit, whether you're cruising through a city or out on the open highway. It might seem simple, but there are some important details to keep in mind. For instance, the source material emphasizes that it's the location itself, not just the presence of a sign, that determines the speed limit. So even if you haven't seen a speed limit sign in a while, you're still expected to know and obey the limit for that specific area.
So no excuses for claiming ignorance. I didn't see the sign won't fly. The document also mentions different methods for measuring speed, like radar, pacing, and estimation. What's the significance of that? Are those just different ways for law enforcement officers to catch speeders?
You got it. Those are the tools and techniques that law enforcement officers use to determine if you're exceeding the speed limit. Radar uses radio waves to bounce signals off your car and measure your speed. Pacing involves an officer driving behind you at a constant speed, matching your pace and observing their speedometer reading. And estimation relies on an officer's visual judgment and experience to assess your speed.
Okay, so whether it's high-tech radar or good old-fashioned observation, the police have multiple ways to determine if you're speeding. No escaping their watchful eyes. The source material also mentions speed against a highway sign. How is that different from the general speed limit offense? Aren't they basically the same thing?
Not quite. This offense specifically addresses exceeding the speed limit indicated on a regulatory speed limit sign, those black and white signs you see along the road. The document outlines several key elements that must be met for this offense to stick. The sign must be in place. It must be regulatory, black and white. It must have been erected by a person of authority. It must be clearly visible to drivers. And you must have passed the sign before exceeding the limit.
So if a speed limit sign is obscured by trees or vandalized, could that impact the validity of a speeding ticket?
Yeah,
If I can't see the sign, how am I supposed to know the speed limit?
that's a great point. If the sign isn't clearly visible, or if it's been tampered with in a way that makes it misleading, it could potentially be grounds for challenging a speeding ticket. However, the onus would be on you, the driver, to prove that the sign wasn't adequately displayed. It's always best to err on the side of caution and assume the speed limit is in effect, even if you haven't seen a sign recently.
Okay, so always pay attention to those speed limit signs. Now let's talk about speeding in a school zone. I know those are strictly enforced and for good reason. What makes this offense unique?
Speeding in a school zone carries heightened penalties because it endangers the safety of children, who are more vulnerable as pedestrians and cyclists. The source material highlights that on a regular school day between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., or during any extended times indicated on the signs, the speed limit near a school building and its grounds is typically 30 kilometers, much lower than the usual speed limits in residential areas.
So if I'm rushing to work and I speed through a school zone at 8 or 5 a.m., even though the kids haven't arrived yet, can I still get a ticket?
Absolutely. The time restrictions are in place to create a consistent safety zone around schools, regardless of whether children are present at that specific moment.
Okay.
The law recognizes that children's arrival and departure times can vary, and it aims to create a buffer of protection. It's about preventing potential tragedies, not just reacting to them.
That makes sense. It's about prioritizing the safety of children, even if they're not immediately visible. Okay, the document also mentions excessive speed. What's that all about? Is that just a fancy way of saying really, really speeding?
It's more than just speeding. It's about reckless disregard for safety. Excessive speed is a more serious speeding offense that involves exceeding the posted speed limit by more than 40 kilometers. It carries heavier fines and potential consequences, including license suspensions and even jail time, because it demonstrates a blatant disregard for safety and significantly increases the risk of a serious collision. The document notes that exceeding the speed limit by 41 to 60 kilometers results in a higher fine than regular speeding, and exceeding it by 61 kilometers or more carries an even heavier fine.
So if the speed limit is 80 kilometers and I'm caught driving 125 kilometers, that's excessive speed, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm exceeding the limit by 45 kilometers, putting myself and everyone else on the road at risk.
That's exactly right. Excessive speed is a major contributing factor to serious accidents, and the law reflects that with enhanced penalties. It's a message that needs to be taken seriously. Now, let's shift gears again and talk about a driving offense that's become increasingly prevalent in recent years: distracted driving. With smartphones and all the technology in our cars these days, it's a growing concern. What are the key elements of this offense?
Okay, distracted driving. This one hits close to home for a lot of people, myself included.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of checking my phone at red lights sometimes. What exactly constitutes distracted driving in the eyes of the law?
Distracted driving is about using an electronic device while driving, specifically in a way that takes your focus away from the road. This includes talking on the phone, texting, emailing, browsing the internet, watching videos, or even just holding the device in your hand. The law recognizes that these actions divert your attention from driving, increasing your risk of an accident.
So if I'm stopped at a red light and I quickly check my phone, is that distracted driving?
That's a gray area. While the law primarily focuses on preventing drivers from using devices while the vehicle is in motion, even using a device while stopped at a light can be risky and could potentially lead to a ticket, depending on the circumstances and the interpretation of the law by the officer. It's always best to err on the side of caution and avoid using your phone at all while behind the wheel. Develop good habits and make a conscious effort to stay focused on driving.
Okay, point taken. It's just not worth the risk. Are there any exceptions to the distracted driving rules? Like, what if I need to call 911 in an emergency?
Yes, there are a few exceptions. You're allowed to use a hands-free device to make or receive calls if it's properly secured and doesn't require you to hold it. You can also use a device to call 911 in an emergency. And certain professionals, like police officers, firefighters, and paramedics, are exempt from the rules while performing their duties. But for the average driver, it's best to keep those phones tucked away and focus on the road.
Okay, so those are the limited scenarios where using a device is permitted. Otherwise, it's hands off the phone.
Got it. Now I'm seeing an offense called disobeying movement prohibition sign. That seems pretty self-explanatory. What are the key elements here?
This offense involves ignoring a traffic control device that prohibits a specific vehicle movement, like a no left turn or no U-turn sign. It's about following the rules of the road and
Mhm.
ensuring smooth traffic flow.
Okay.
For this offense to stick, the sign must be in place, erected by someone in authority, and visible to the driver.
So if I'm in a rush and I make an illegal U-turn claiming I didn't see the sign, is that a valid defense? Sorry, officer, I must have missed that sign.
Not likely. Ignorance of the law is not a defense.
Right.
If the sign is there and it's visible, you're expected to obey it. The onus would be on you to prove that the sign wasn't adequately displayed or that there were extenuating circumstances that justified your actions. Okay, fair enough. No shortcuts or excuses when it comes to traffic signs. Now let's talk about a classic driving no-no, disobeying a stop sign. What makes this offense tick?
This one's all about failing to come to a complete stop at a stop sign before proceeding.
Right.
The stop sign must be in place, erected by a person of authority, and visible to the driver.
Okay.
And the document emphasizes that a stop means a complete cessation of movement, not just slowing down or doing a California roll.
So if I do a rolling stop at a stop sign, am I still in violation?
Yes, you are. A rolling stop is still a violation because it doesn't meet the requirement of coming to a complete stop.
Mm.
The law is very clear on this point, and even a slight movement of the vehicle while crossing the stop line can result in a ticket. Stop signs are there for a reason to ensure safety at intersections. Treat them with respect.
Okay, no cutting corners when it comes to stop signs. Got it. Now let's talk about red lights. What are the key elements of failing to stop for a red light at an intersection? Is it just as simple as it sounds?
It might seem simple, but there are a few nuances. This offense involves entering an intersection while facing a red light on a traffic control signal. The light must be functional. The lights at the intersection must be synchronized. And you, the driver, must have approached the intersection and proceeded through it while the light was red.
So if I enter an intersection on a yellow light and the light turns red before I clear the intersection, am I in violation?
That's a tricky one. The law is designed to prevent drivers from entering an intersection on a red light. So if you enter on a yellow and the light turns red while you're still in the intersection, you're technically not in violation. However, it's always best to exercise caution and avoid entering an intersection if the light is about to change. You don't want to get caught in the middle of the intersection when the light turns red. The document also lists several other red light-related offenses, such as failing to yield on a right or left turn at a red light, and running a red light when there's no intersection, like at a pedestrian crosswalk.
So those are the red light scenarios to watch out for.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with these Highway Traffic Act offenses. Speeding, distracted driving, stop signs, red lights. But there's one more I want to touch on before we wrap things up. It's something that might seem minor, but it's actually crucial for safety on the road. Failing to signal a lane change. What are the key elements of this offense?
This offense involves changing lanes on a laned roadway without properly signaling your intention. You must signal using either hand and arm signals
Right.
or an approved mechanical device like your turn signal. It's all about communicating your intentions to other drivers and preventing those "what are you doing" moments on the road.
So if I forget to use my turn signal when merging onto a highway, is that a violation?
Yes, it is. Signaling is crucial for communicating your intentions to other drivers.
And preventing accidents. The law requires you to signal before changing lanes, merging, turning, or pulling over to the side of the road. Failing to signal can result in a ticket and potentially increase your risk of a collision. Don't be that driver who leaves everyone else guessing.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. From serious criminal offenses
Yeah.
to those everyday traffic violations that can really sneak up on you. This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but I have to admit it's also a little overwhelming. There's so much to remember. What are some key takeaways for our listeners? What do you hope they'll remember from this episode?
You're right. We've delved into a lot of legal territory today,
Yeah.
from the complexities of assault and theft to the nuances of speeding and distracted driving. I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding the essential elements of these offenses can empower you to make informed decisions and avoid potential legal trouble. It's all about knowing your rights and responsibilities and acting in a way that respects the law and the safety of others.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has definitely given me a new appreciation for the complexities of the Canadian legal system, but it's also given me a sense of empowerment. Like I'm better equipped to navigate those complexities and stay on the right side of the law. Now, before we wrap up this episode, I have one final question for you. What's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today? Something that will really stick with them and encourage them to keep learning and exploring the world of law.
That's a great question. I think the most important thing to remember is that laws are constantly evolving. What's legal today might not be legal tomorrow, and what's considered a minor offense now could become a more serious offense in the future. So it's always a good idea to stay informed about any changes or updates that might affect you. Don't be afraid to ask questions, seek clarification, and advocate for your rights. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to the law. And remember, this deep dive has just scratched the surface. There's a whole world of legal intricacies to explore, and I encourage you to keep digging deeper.
Well said. Knowledge is power, and it's never too late to learn something new. This has been quite the journey through the Canadian Criminal Code and Highway Traffic Act. We've unpacked a lot of dense legal concepts, from the elements of assault and theft to the nuances of speeding and distracted driving. Hopefully you're feeling more confident about navigating those legal waters now.
Absolutely. Remember,
Mhm.
this deep dive has just scratched the surface. There's a whole world of legal intricacies within each of these offenses, but you've got a solid foundation now, and hopefully it's sparked your curiosity to learn even more.
Now that you've gotten a taste of these essential elements, what stands out to you as most surprising or significant? And how might this knowledge influence your own actions or interactions with law enforcement? Something to ponder. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. It's amazing to think about how much ground we've covered in this deep dive into Canadian criminal law. I mean, we've talked about everything,
Yeah.
from shouting matches to hostage situations to, uh,
Right.
tricky legal procedures.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
But amidst all these details, something that really struck me was the importance of intent in many of these offenses. It seems like whether it's assault, theft, mischief, or even some of those traffic violations we talked about, intent often plays a crucial role. Like, it's not just about the act itself, but also about the state of mind of the person committing the act, right?
You've hit on a key principle of criminal law there.
Okay.
It's called mens rea, Latin for guilty mind.
Oh, okay.
So to be convicted of most crimes, the prosecution has to prove not only that you committed the act, that's the actus reus or the guilty act,
Right.
but also that you had the requisite mental state. So that could be intent, knowledge, recklessness, or negligence, depending on the offense. It's about holding people accountable for their choices and their understanding of the consequences of those choices.
That makes sense. It's not about punishing people for accidents or unintentional harm. It's about addressing those deliberate acts that violate the law and potentially harm others. Before we wrap up completely, I want to circle back to those sections we touched on earlier, the charge sections, routine offenses, and Miller's exam offense section. They seemed particularly relevant for someone who's diving deep into Canadian criminal law. Why do these sections stand out?
Those sections provide really valuable insights into how the law is applied, in practice in Canada. The charge sections, routine offenses, highlights those crimes that are most commonly encountered by law enforcement and legal professionals. It's almost like a snapshot of their day-to-day work in the criminal justice system.
So it's a reminder that the law isn't just this abstract concept out there. It's a living, breathing system that affects real people every day.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, what about the Miller's exam offense section? What can we learn from that?
Well, those are offenses that are considered serious enough to warrant a judicial hearing to determine if there's enough evidence for a case. These hearings, they're called Miller's exams, and they usually take place when a person is being held in custody, like when they haven't been released on bail. It helps to ensure that those who could pose a threat to public safety are detained, but also that people aren't held without proper justification.
So it's about finding that balance again, right? Protecting individual rights while making sure the community is safe. This has been an incredibly insightful journey, really, exploring all these essential elements of offenses in Canada, from breaches of the peace to
Mm-hmm.
hostage situations, from speeding tickets to, you know,
So
uh,
all sorts of things, yeah.
it's fascinating and a little bit overwhelming.
A lot to absorb.
It is. I don't know about you, but I feel like my head is just buzzing with all this new legal knowledge.
I hear ya. It's been a whirlwind tour of Canadian criminal law, and hopefully everyone listening is feeling just as informed, and as energized to learn more.
I hope so too, because remember, this deep dive has really just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover, so much more to learn, so I encourage everyone to keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and until next time, stay curious and stay informed.